Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. I'm Ian Lesser with GMF here in Brussels, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this conversation today about the future of the Republican Party. What's next? Thanks for joining us. We have a wonderful conversation set up, and we couldn't have had a better person to come and join us for this. Congressman Will Hurd. Congressman Will Hurd has been a member of Congress since 2014. He's a computer scientist by training. He had a professional career in the intelligence services, the CIA, before becoming a congressman. He's also, I'm very happy to say, a member of the GMF Board of Trustees. And will offer us, I think, a very interesting, his own distinctive personal view on what we can expect from the Republican Party, what the elections tell us about the GOP and what we might expect over the next year, and also what it might mean for transatlantic relations. To moderate this conversation, I'm also really delighted to have with us today Kristine Berzina, who's a senior fellow with the Alliance for Securing Democracy at GMF and based here in Brussels as well. Kristine, thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman. Kristine, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, for your kind introductory remarks, and thank you, Congressman, very much for joining us today. Welcome to a conversation about the future of the Republican Party and what comes next. We have all of you joining us today on both sides of the Atlantic, Europeans, Americans, North Americans broadly, coming together to think about something that really matters for all of us. Here at GMF, we think about many issues, and domestic policy, foreign policy, and it really matters what happens on the U.S., in particular, what happens in one of the major political parties on these issues. We are a week and a half after the presidential election, but also the congressional elections taking place at this time. And it's a good time then to look at what has happened over the last 4 years, what has happened over the last week, and then looking forward in the next few weeks and few years where this could take us. It has been a very long few weeks and feels more like months perhaps as we try to process all of the developments. And I'm sure that as the weeks ahead unroll, deciphering what comes next, what it means for the US and what it means for the transatlantic relationship is going to be quite a significant task. So Congressman, thank you again so much for joining us. And could you give a few reflections about where the GOP is today?
Sure. Well, so one, it's a pleasure to be with y'all. This is an important conversation. And why should we matter what the future of the GOP is? We should matter because the way that the United States of America has operated, it's this competition of ideas between two strong parties. And so whether I tell people here in Texas, whether you're Republican or not, or whether you vote or don't vote, you should care because that competition of ideas is important. And unfortunately, I think over the last 20 years, there's this notion in politics that the only way to get things done is through unified government, meaning that the same party has the House, the Senate, and the White House. But what happens on the unified government is you pass things and then it's only lasts for 2 years. And then the next group comes in and tries to dismantle everything the last person did. And I think the perfect example of that is the Affordable Care Act, or what we refer to as Obamacare. And so we need to get back to this notion of the only way we've gotten big things done is by doing it together. And if you look at all major legislation that has ever moved, it's been done in a split House and Senate, and it's been done in an overwhelming fashion. So that's why this conversation matters. What is the state of the GOP? And I would say that there is, and you can't talk about the state of the GOP without talking about the state of the Democratic Party either. So Kristine, I'll hit both of those. There's 2 lessons from 2020, in my opinion. Number one, don't be an asshole. Okay, pardon my undiplomatic language, but I don't know any other way to say it. And number 2, don't be a socialist, right? Like this is the key takeaway, and this is what the American people have said. Joe Biden won with 0 coattails. The fact that in the House, when all the votes are counted, Nancy Pelosi will probably only have a 5 to 8 person majority. That's impossible for her to get anything done with just that majority. But Donald Trump brought people out to vote that have never voted before. So the battle within a lot of folks within the Republican Party is, how do you attract and those Donald Trump voters? How do you get them to come back out in 2022 and 2024? And I think that understanding that context is why you're seeing some people have a tacit support of the president's efforts to try to criticize, or to say that he still won. It's important. Every vote should be counted. Period. End of story. And if you have evidence of fraud, that should be brought forward. But we're not seeing any evidence of fraud actually being brought forward. And election administrators have all said that this has been one of the most secure elections. And what we learned from the 2016 election and the concern about Russia trying to tamper in our elections made people focus a little bit more. So this is where the moment that we're in right now. Kevin McCarthy, the leader of Republicans in the House of Representatives, feels emboldened because he picked up seats when nobody thought that was going to happen. Mitch McConnell is feeling confident because going into Georgia, that the likelihood is those two special elections in Georgia come to the Republicans. And you have a Joe Biden that came in without bringing in coattails, and you have a Nancy Pelosi who's going to have a wild caucus. So Republicans feel like they have everything. Things are looking good for us. Oh, and by the way, history tells us that in the first election after a president gets elected, his party loses a lot of seats in the House and the Senate. So that means 2022, starting right now, 2 years from now, things are looking good and up for Republicans. So that's kind of the context in which we're sitting.
Thank you. I mean, that's a optimistic and quite cheerful look coming off of last week. When you look at the congressional votes, that is absolutely the case, where you do see such continued strength, actually also in other races, within the state level, Republicans doing incredibly well. But again, especially European.
Kristine, to your point, right? Like we picked up 2 state legislatures, right? This was in all of the last 50 years, the least amount of state legislators flipped, right? And the fact that Republicans picked up 2, that's why this notion of it was a rebuke. America rebuked Donald Trump, right? And then they rebuked this notion of where the Democratic Party is going, which is why at all these down ballot seats, you saw Republican victory. So ultimately, we're divided. We're a divided country. And my argument is, hey, real simple. Actually, we'd be being more successful if people actually liked us, right? And if we weren't viewed as racist or misogynist or things like that. And that's the message that we have to push. And so why does this matter for the transatlantic relationship? And to me, we have to get beyond this, because there are some generational defining struggles that we're going to have to deal with. And one of those is this race for global leadership in advanced technology between the United States and our allies and the government of China. That is going to drive and it's going to have a larger impact on Europe, on America, on our futures, on the world economy. And we can't get to that and talking about solutions to that if we continue to have what ultimately are petty fights to saying, hey, we won, right? And when we should be talking about how can we do things in a bipartisan way.
I totally agree with you. And I think that there's a lot to do, even in this conversation today, in terms of transatlantic cooperation. But we still can't get over the fact that we don't have consensus about who won. So I know you came out right after the election and called for national unity and really quite, repairing vision for the U.S. But what's going on? What's going on the Hill? What are the Republicans? What is the view of Republicans on the presidential election results? Is there going to be a consensus there before we get to January?
Yeah, there's absolutely going to be a consensus. And if you parse the statements, right, of the elected officials, they're generally saying we should make sure all legal votes are counted. Okay. And again, maybe I'm wrong. I don't monitor everybody's statements, but no, I don't think there's anybody going to say that there was this was being stolen, or that Trump is the rightful winner. I think most of the Republicans are making comments saying, let's ensure every vote is counted, right? And so that's where I think folks are. I think you're starting to see members of the Senate, Republicans in the Senate, talk about the need for President-elect Biden to start getting the intelligence briefings and things like that. There's this issue about a GSA, the government's, the General Services Administration. They're kind of like the admin office for the entire federal government, where there's certain dollars that are federal dollars that are given for transition teams, but President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris have already had their transition teams. Those transition teams are already working. There will be a peaceful transfer of power, and everything is kind of moving in that direction. But again, many of these folks are saying these things because they're thinking about, how do you keep a Trump voter, this unique Trump voter, which exists, how can you make sure that they're going to be on your side going forward?
That's really helpful insight into what's going on in the head of many of your colleagues right now. You bring up an interesting point, which is the unique Trump voter, which is a question that many people have. What is Trumpism? How is it related to what we think of as the GOP? And are these things matched forever? Is Trumpism a part of the GOP for the foreseeable future? Or are these things separate? What do you think?
So they're not separate, and while it's, I would even say there's a nuance in the language. It's not Trumpism, it's Trump voterism, right? Because it is, he has tapped into something that exists in the electorate, right? And that trend, and that I would say that Donald Trump is the continuation of a trend that had already existed. And so I think part of this is around some of the it's the socioeconomic concerns around globalism and the our evolving economy to a knowledge economy, right? And so this fear of the future. And so why did in 2016 it was NAFTA a issue in the election? Right? NAFTA has increased the economies of the US, Mexico, and Canada by 400%, right? The US, Mexico, and Canada, we build things together. But why was NAFTA in 2016 an issue? Now, there were jobs displaced. There's no doubt about it when it was enacted 25 years ago. And had we gone back 25 years, some things may have been different. That's why we try to update those things in the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or NAFTA 2.0. So it's this fear, right, that my ability to put food on my table, a roof over my head, and take care of the people that I love and be happy is going to be impacted by globalization, by an influx of immigration, by this transfer of this super evolution of technology. So I think that's at the core. Oh, and then there is this hyper political correctness that is being seen as condescension, right? And so all of those things lead to contempt. And when somebody thinks the other side is a villain, right, then you harden this partisanship. So I think that those are the pressures that are impacting an individual voter who may vote for someone who they don't like, but they voted for him because, you know what, I would rather care about my ability to take care of my family. Why did you see many in Latino districts in South Texas, which as I represent? So I represent 820 miles of the border between the U.S. and Mexico. That's probably 1,200 kilometers. And that is, in some of these districts, Donald Trump improved significantly or even won. Why? Because a lot of those communities are involved in the energy sector. And this concern that the energy sector that has been in South and West Texas has been driving the US economy was to get completely dismantled, was another reason that people ultimately came out and supported President Trump. Now, President Trump's numbers in Texas still decreased from 2016. And even further from when Mitt Romney was a Republican nominee. Mitt Romney won Texas by 17 points. Donald Trump only won Texas in 2016 by 9, and when all the votes are finally counted, he'll probably have only won Texas by 6. So you're still seeing that shrinking, but 6 is still a pretty large margin. So those are some of the factors in play. Oh, and by the way, hyperpartisanship in the United States of America. This election in the House, only 34 seats were truly competitive. These are split tickets, or what we call split tickets. That means in the previous election, people voted for one party for president and another party for Congress. So this cycle, only 31 Democrats were in seats that Donald Trump won in 2016, and only 3 Republicans were in seats Hillary Clinton won. And my district was one of those. And so that is 34 over 435, quick math lesson for everybody on the call, that's only 8%. So only 8% of these congressional districts were decided in November, which means 92% are decided in a primary with the most partisan people in the country. And that's why these people are only talking to those partisans.
You're really showing a fractured and also very nuanced portrait of the United States politically. We have a few questions coming in. As for all the participants, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're having a conversation here, and then towards the end, we can have more of an open Q&A with the questions that you submit. There are a couple of points of clarification, though. We have a question coming in saying, asking to specify which party Congressman Hurd is from. You are from the Republican Party, so that is clarification for everyone on the call if that hasn't been clear thus far. And just building upon what you've been speaking about just now, there's a question from Norman Blevins about whether you could get into more details about the competing factions within the GOP, specifically about the Lincoln Project and what that, how that relates to the rest of the GOP. So can we just, dovetailing quickly on what we
Sure. Yeah. So Lincoln Project was a bunch of political operatives that ran ads read ads against Donald Trump and against people that they view was empowering Donald Trump. At the end of the day, can you assess whether they were successful or not? Joe Biden won, but when you look at all the down ballots, right? A recent assessment of all the money spent in this 2020 election, it more than doubled the amount of money spent in 2016, and 65% of the money that was spent was spent in support of Democratic candidates. And so the Lincoln Party, these are political operatives, right? This notion that they're a faction of the GOP or the Republican Party, I don't think that's the case. These are guys that were using their skill sets to do what they thought that they should do and make money from it. So the real differences I think you're going to see within the GOP is some of our governors, right? Our governors are the ones that, especially in some states that are not ruby red. So you got like Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, you got Larry Hogan in Maryland. This is where kind of the counterbalance of some of this national rhetoric has always been. You obviously have folks and leaders in the Senate that have been around for a long time. Some have been pro Trump, some have not. But I think what you're going to see is, especially in the House, a coalescing of Republicans in the House to fight Nancy Pelosi. But the question becomes, does Mitch McConnell want to do deals with Joe Biden? And if they're able to do that, they could potentially put pressure on Nancy Pelosi. And in my view, in my time in interaction with Speaker Pelosi, probably the best vote counter in Washington, D.C., but she has no interest in working with Republicans on any legislation of significance.
Thank you. So we're talking right now about the shifts between the potentially different factions in the party, and you were talking more about maybe there is more unity. From the European perspective, there are questions about the populist part of the Republican Party. Is the Republican Party similar in some ways to PiS in Poland or Fidesz in Hungary? And is it going? What portion of the party follows maybe more this model? And then what is, on the contrary side, the future of conservatism in the more traditional sense in the Republican Party? Maybe the future of the party, is there a future of the party that looks more like John McCain and what he represented? And how do those two things look to you?
Sure. So I don't think in American politics that we can think of political thought on a linear line anymore, right? It's a horseshoe. And so the edges are closer to each other than they are to the middle. So I would say that the far left looks more like the far right, especially when it comes to populism, right? So Donald Trump won in 2016 talking about how bad NAFTA was. Guess who else was talking about how bad NAFTA was? Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. And so when you look at some of the anti-globalist sentiment within American political life, it is on the edges, right? So it's the far left and the far right that views that way. And both of those movements are fueled by populism that has a little bit of nativism in it. I think the nativism is probably a little bit further on the far right than the far left. But those tendencies and those influences are still there. So if we're worried about populism, so how is this going to transact in Congress? So when you look at some of the policies of what this Trump administration passed, I think 75%. Let's take a number. Is it 80%? Is it 72%? It's a super majority, or were some fairly traditional Republican values, right? If you look at the signature piece of legislation under the last 4 years, it was the Trump tax cuts, right? Which was a effort spearheaded in the House by House Republicans and Speaker Paul Ryan, to be frank, and I think he's a classic conservative. When you look at some legislation that may pass in this lame duck, when it comes to retirement, it's actually influenced by classic conservatism, and so there is still enough of those, and I think the House probably has more. When you look at when it comes to foreign policy, a guy like a Mike McCall from Texas, my colleague, he's going to be the ranking member, the senior Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. This is a guy who's in the mold of a Mac Thornberry. How the Senate decides to react, the Senate map in 2022 is going to influence that, and it goes back to who are those people that are trying to chase those Trump voters. And so how does this play out ultimately in policy? I think one of the biggest issues early on that's going to have a transatlantic impact is going to be the Iran deal. Most Republicans are against this. I think in day one, Joe Biden's going to get back in the Paris Accord. There's nothing congressional leaders can do against that. And to be frank, a lot of Republicans are supportive of recognize that climate change is real and it's having an impact on our world. I think some of the problems we have with the Paris Accord is that there's not enough restrictions on the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians to do some of the same things that we're asking North Americans and Europeans to do, and also how can we be working together to help some of these economies jumpstart, or to jump technologies and help them get to cleaner fuels. Right, it's 4 billion people still without access to electricity, and so that's Paris. But the Iran deal, I hope Joe Biden doesn't try to make this a early foreign policy objective, because that is going to darken the waters for cooperation in the future. Because I think it's uniform of Republican opposition for the Iran deal as we knew it, that was negotiated under the Obama administration.
Thank you. I mean, this is a really good transition more to the foreign policy topics. because I think, looking broadly at the party is one thing, but there's a lot of interest really on what happens in the future of American foreign policy, and in particular, what are the views on the GOP? You talked about Trump voterism as apart from Trumpism itself. In your view, how much does the Trump voter care about foreign policy? A lot of the things that have been really controversial in transatlantic relationship in the context of Trumpism is perhaps the question of NATO and commitments to NATO, defense spending. Is this an interest of the Trump voter? Is this something that is going to affect broadly the GOP foreign policy position? So this is important really, I think, for a lot of Europeans. And broadly, what is GOP foreign policy post-Trump?
Sure. So NATO still matters, right? Because again, 2016, who would have thought NATO and NAFTA were two major issues? And so part of and the narrative, and this is where the majority of Republicans are still, is that NATO is important, but the financing piece needs to be met, right? And I think over the last 4 years, you've seen that commitment from our European partners increase. And so you don't see the issue of should we be part of NATO? That has kind of fallen to the wayside because President Trump has been successful in seeing our European allies increase their contributions to their own defense. And we've had to remind people 70 years of peace and prosperity in Europe is pretty good for America too, right? And so for those of us that understand and recognize the importance of NATO and why this was important to the American economy, needs to go and continue to explain that to folks. I think the Trump voter cares about Afghanistan and Iraq and what is articulated in the media as endless wars, right? And pulling away from those. And why are we in some of those places? I think the vestiges of that still exist in part of the party. However, when you look at over the last 2 years, some of the votes that have happened where condemn pulling support to the Kurds in Iraq, pulling troops out of Afghanistan, there was an overwhelming number of Republicans that were against that because they understood the importance of that to the global war on terrorism, right? And so I would still say that, excuse me, the majority of the Republican Party still understands and recognizes what I would say is that our enemies need to fear us and our allies need to actually like us, and that we have to work together. One of the problems that we're going to see, I think every American president, whether you're Republican or Democrat, since Bill Clinton, thinks you can reset the relationship with Russia. Every administration that's come in every administration that comes in underestimates the global threat of the Chinese government, right? And every administration they come in, they think somehow that North Korea is going to become a normal nation, right? Those are the three mistakes that we see presidents have made, at least since Bill Clinton, maybe even before that. And these are going to be some of the areas where you're going to see, we'll see what happens between congressional Republicans. One of the areas that I think is going to go away, this notion about, is Russia an adversary, right? They are an adversary, period, in the story. Vladimir Putin's a regional thug, right, who is trying to reestablish the territorial integrity of the USSR. Oh, and by the way, right, there was no consequences when they went in and tried to annex lands in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Georgia, right? And so this got confused with the issue of collusion, right? That the Trump campaign worked with the Russians to win an election. And that's different from the Russians were trying to erode trust in our democratic institutions through our 2016 election. And there's this weird narrative that Republicans didn't believe that Russia's a threat. Republicans believe that Russia was a threat. It was this conflating the issue of collusion with the threat of Russia that I think got messed up in the media. And so I think we're going to see, and Republicans are going to hope that Joe Biden continues some of the financial measures that have been used to put pressure on the Russian government around the world.
I think that's quite a relief to hear, perhaps to many on the side of the Atlantic, to hear the GOP having much more traditional foreign policy stance on the questions of Russia. But when we go beyond Russia, where are the potential areas for further cooperation between the US and Europe? What are the places where really both sides should put their heads together? And what are the challenges that really they can both help each other solve?
So where we can and where we should, maybe different questions. But for me, it has to be on China, right? And look, I think when it comes to some of the trade agreements that the Trump administration pulled out of, we shouldn't have. Those were designed in order to work with our allies to make sure that the Chinese government was adhering to global norms and standards. And how specifically the new Cold War is being fought in cyberspace, right? And so this notion of who is going to be the global leader on advanced technology. We know the Chinese are trying to surpass the United States as a global hegemon, and they're going to do it by being a leader in 12 to 15 different areas of technology like 5G, AI, quantum, things like that. And so we have to make sure that we're cooperating and that we're driving a Western liberal, little L, democratic values in the ethics around new technology, especially like things around artificial intelligence, because the only way we're going to catch up with an authoritarian government, and I use that word catch up specifically because I do believe we're behind. When you look at the amount of research that the Chinese government has put into advanced technology this year, as they surpassed the United States, but if you turn that into man and woman hours, they surpassed us years ago, right? And when you look at their focus and dominance on 5G and how they've won that race, why are we not doing more to ensure Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung are valuable and are able to compete with Huawei? Now, we don't need, we know why Huawei is competitive because the Chinese government is underwriting it and supporting it, but how can we put things in place to do long-term contracts for Nokia and Samsung and Ericsson, right? This is some areas, but we also, in order to deal with ethics around technology, we have to get over this privacy beef, right? And the US and Europe view privacy way closer than Europe views privacy with the government of China, right? And this I don't have to get into a lesson. Y'all know this better than I do about Snowden and how that happened and GDPR, right? And okay, everybody was talking about, and on the US side, on our side of the Atlantic, GDPR is gonna be terrible, the sky's gonna fall. Well, the sky didn't fall, right? You just figured out there's a whole lot of websites I go to that have cookies on it, right? But have the benefits that we thought of GDPR, have those materialized as well, right? And we need to have a frank and sober assessment of that. So let's stop beefing, right? I think in many European capitals, it has been politically expedient to trash and to bash American tech companies, right, and American policies on privacy, because that's the boogeyman, and that leads to electoral success. Just like we like creating our own boogeymans here. We got to get beyond some of that, because there is no second place when it comes to global leadership in artificial intelligence. There is no second place when it comes to global leadership in quantum computing. And the only way that we're going to win is if we all work together, and that should drive a lot of our interactions.
There's a specific question on this coming from the participants, and that is on the question of U.S. privacy legislation. So should the U.S. pass its own privacy legislation to be able to bridge better to Europe in order to solve the problem of AI and to be able to
100%.
Yeah, so it is as possible.
So is it possible, right? Yeah, whether it should happen and is it possible, right? Like that's the $1 million question. So it starts with it having a national breach standard, right, in the United States of America. The reason there isn't a national breach standard in the United States of America is because of the conflict between financial services industry and retailers, right? And how each industry is going to be potentially impacted. There needs to be a national breach standard. When I first came into Congress, most Republicans were saying, hey, this is not a federal issue, state by state. I think most people have gotten to the point where, you know, having 47, there's 47 different state laws dealing with national breach or digital breach. We recognize that there shouldn't be that many. That's step one. And so now you can't talk about breach without talking about privacy. And so what is, you know, the phrase, you know, what PII, personally identifiable information, what the hell is that anymore, right? Like, what is HIPAA? This is for health information. And so this is where in the US, having standards across all industries is important. NIST is a player in that, but it starts with a fundamental question: whose data is it? Now, I personally believe that data is mine, right? What I click on, what I do online, all that is mine, and I should be able to have control over it, right? So if we start with that, then we can build a regulatory regime around that. And so right now, I would say Susan DelBene, Democrat from Washington State, former tech executive, her legislation on privacy is probably the thing that is closest. I think a version of that is what would ultimately get passed. You know, hopefully my last piece of legislation is going to be a national strategy on artificial intelligence, which calls for a privacy standard. But this is something that is going to be important to try to get done. And with this focus on what's called Section 230 in the United States, this is the law that determines whether you know, Facebook and Twitter is liable for the information that is put on their systems. That is something far left, far right, or even, you know, not just the extremes, right? You know, a lot of people on either political divide believes need to be focused on. I think we're going to see that be a focus over this next year in both the House and the Senate. So those conversations, I hope, lead to an ability to have a privacy standard that where us in Europe can get on the same page a little bit more, because we should be talking about how do we share data with each other? What kinds of data sets should we be making public so that we can train our algorithms? We're not going to ever have as much data as the Chinese government, so we have to share with our partners a little bit more. We have to be developing algorithms that are trained on less data, because we're not going to beat the Chinese at their own game. This is where the conversation should be, not what is privacy, right?
Yeah. I think this is really important, of course, and the instrumentalization of some of the questions of privacy. How do we solve these problems at home, and then work together, the transatlantic partners together, to solve bigger global issues, such as what China brings to the table on these issues, right? So this is something I think we're discussing here, that is this potential for cooperation and gets at the big question you're saying that the transatlantic partners need to work together on, which is the question of China. We have a cluster of questions coming through about multilateralism. Over the past 4 years, we've seen the US withdraw from a series of international agreements and multilateral organizations. How do you see the future of US participation and GOP support for US participation in the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization? We already talked about Paris a bit. What is that going to mean also for the US's global role?
Donald Trump took us out of some of those things, and Joe Biden's going to put us back in, right? And regardless of what congressional interest is, I also think, like, when it comes to like the WHO, right? I think many, unfortunately, the only voices that get amplified on some of these issues are the craziest voices, right? And so the craziest voices are the ones that everybody takes as the average when it comes to the WHO. I would say when it comes to an organization like WHO, my position on this is probably the average, where It's an important organization and has done a lot of great in the world, but there were some questions they needed to answer to, and there should be a level of accounting on why they made the decision that they made, right? And I know that is shared by most of our allies, because I actually wrote a letter asking all of our, and many of the embassies that are on this call that answered that letter. Thank you very much for giving your perspective. But many of our allies had some of the same concerns about what the WHO was doing vis-a-vis China when it comes to COVID, right? Because look, COVID is the number one issue. COVID is number two issue. COVID is number three issue, right? And we have to be working together on this, and we need an institution like WHO, but the WHO needs to be mindful of this. So you're going to see a return to multilateralism, if I can say that. There will be some in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that disagrees with that, but I would say the supermajority of Congress is supportive and recognizes the need for that.
Thanks. So we only have a few minutes left, and there are a few more questions about trade. The WTO touched on that there. There's a question about what you see as the potential for de-escalation of the trade tensions between Europe and the United States. We've seen a lot of tension, particularly between Germany and the US in rhetoric from President Trump. And we have questions then on what happens in that future relationship. I mean, this past week hasn't been a great one for smooth trade ties across the Atlantic. So what's the trajectory there? What is the GOP, your view and the GOP's view on it? And even we have some questions, could we get back to the point of talking about free trade agreements across the Atlantic where we were earlier in this decade?
The answer is, so I personally believe that these tariffs, this is a blunt object that, doesn't work and actually ends up impacting and hurting the American consumer, right? The US agriculture industry should be outraged, right, by what these tariffs have done to their industry. And so I think the answer is yes, we will get there. And what's fascinating is Republicans are usually the ones that are there, right? And the ones that push these. We were able to get some of the trade agreements done in Congress under Barack Obama because we were in control of the House and the Senate and passed trade legislation that Obama wanted to get done, right? And so the folks congressionally that have been involved in those prior to Donald Trump are still around, and they're going to be involved in this going forward, right? And so the real question becomes, are we willing to help? Are Republicans going to be able to work together, right? Is Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden going to be willing to deal with their far left? Because here's what's going to happen. If Pelosi works with Republicans, her far left is going to crucify her for being more willing to work with Republicans than people in her own party. And they're going to say that about Joe Biden as well, too, right? That Joe Biden's more interested in working with Mitch McConnell than Chuck Schumer. Are the Democrats going to be willing to do that? And are they willing to give, concessions to Republicans in order to get things done? That is going to be the big question. And if the answer is yes, we could get a lot of things done. If the answer is no, absolutely nothing is going to get done, which in some cases is not that bad. And so we're going to be a little bit being on autopilot. So the interest, the philosophy still exists, right? And especially with those Republican leaders that believe in multilateralism, that believe in free trade, that have been negotiating these free trade agreements for the last couple of decades.
Thank you very much. We have about 1 minute left. Could you quickly anticipate for us what the 2024 Republican ticket could look like? Look, here's the mistake people make. You can only think about the next election. And the next election is 2022. And so the world, a year ago, everybody thought Donald Trump was going to win election by a landslide. And 2 months ago, everybody thought that Nancy Pelosi, that Chuck Schumer was going to be the majority leader in the Senate. So things can change, and we got to get through. We got to get through these next couple of years before we can talk about 2024. That's excellent. Thank you so much. And there were many more questions, and I think that I grabbed as many of them as I could to get the main points, the main questions we had out there, and the main topics covered. Thank you again, Congressman, for your time and for your thoughts. It's incredibly helpful on both sides of the Atlantic to understand really beyond the headlines what congressional leaders and Republican leaders are thinking, so we can better plan and also build a better cooperative transatlantic relationship moving forward.
Well, you're too kind, and I just want to say thank everybody at GMF for all that y'all have done for ensuring that this transatlantic cooperation continues. It's been the most successful partnership, I think, in the history of nations. We have to see it continue. We are family, right? We're going to have some tough conversations, but in the end, this is about making sure the world's a better place. And the only way we're going to ensure that happens is if we work together.
Thank you so much. I think those are great words that we can all sign off with. Thank you for joining us, and do tune again for future events at GMF. Thank you.